His mother's satisfying smile across the dining table was the first thing I noticed. Not the contract, not the Mont Blanc pen placed diagonally across the stack of papers like a garnish on a plate nobody ordered. Not even the silence that had fallen over the room so completely you could hear the ice shifting in the water pitcher. No, it was that smile. The one she wore when she believed she had already won something before the other person even knew there was a game. "We think this is more than fair, dear," she said. "Considering everything." Considering everything. 3 words that carried the weight of 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days of my life. 3 words that were supposed to erase every morning I had driven 40 minutes across London to sit with her after her hip replacement. Every roast I had seasoned exactly the way Gerald liked it, because Callum told me his father's palate was particular. Every polite laugh at every veiled comment about my clothes, my flat, my lack of a proper family name. Considering everything. Gerald cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses, the kind with thin gold frames that cost more than my first car. "The terms are straightforward, Eloise. A one-time payment of £30,000 upon signing. In exchange, you agree to a clean and private separation from Callum. No public statements, no social media, no contact with the family going forward. You'll return the ring, of course." Of course. I looked at Callum, my fiancé, the man who had proposed to me on the South Bank 11 months ago while a street musician played something unrecognizable on a violin, and the Thames smelled exactly the way the Thames always smells, which is terrible. But I didn't care because his hands were shaking and his voice cracked on the word, forever. That Callum. He was sitting at the far end of the table, his chair pushed back slightly, his arms crossed, staring at the curtains behind his mother's head as though the brocade pattern held the answers to questions nobody had asked. He said nothing. I let the silence sit for a moment. I've learned to do that. Most people rush to fill silence because it frightens them. They hear nothing and assume something must be wrong. But silence is just a room waiting for the right voice. And I have spent enough of my life speaking into rooms that didn't want to hear me. So I waited. "Eloise?" Patricia prompted. Her fingernails tapped the table once, twice. Manicured, the color of dried roses. "Do you have any questions about the terms?" I did have questions, but not the ones she was expecting. Not, "How could you?" or "Why are you doing this?" or "Callum, are you really going to let them?" Those questions belonged to a version of me that might have existed 3 months ago, before the call from Mr. Harewood, before the folder arrived at my flat in Camberwell, the brown envelope with no return address, just my name typed in clean serif font, and the documents inside that changed the geometry of everything I thought I knew about my own life. Instead, I asked, "Is there water? I'm a bit thirsty." Patricia blinked. Gerald looked at his wife. Callum continued his study of the curtains. "There's a pitcher right there," Gerald said, pointing. "So there is," I said. I poured myself a glass. I drank half of it. I set it down on a coaster because Patricia had once told me, during a lunch I was not originally invited to, that rings on the mahogany gave her migraines. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked at all 3 of them in turn. "I'll need a few days," I said. "We were rather hoping to settle this tonight," Gerald said. His tone was the one he used with waitstaff, with contractors, with anyone he believed existed in a category below his own. Patient, but final. A voice that expected compliance because compliance was all it had ever received. "I understand what you were hoping," I said, "but I'll need a few days." And then I stood up, collected my coat from the back of the chair, and walked out of the dining room of their home in Hampstead, down the hallway with the original William Morris wallpaper they mentioned to every guest within the first 10 minutes, past the framed photograph of Callum at Eton, that made him look like a stranger, through the front door, and into the February night where my breath turned to vapor and the street lamps on Well Walk threw pale circles onto wet pavement. I sat in my car for 7 minutes before I started the engine, not because I was upset, because I was counting the months, counting the lies, counting the distance between who they thought I was and who I actually am. My name is Eloise Marin Ashcroft. I'm 31 years old. I work as a senior policy analyst for the Ministry of Defense, specifically in procurement oversight, which is a title that sounds deeply boring until you understand that it means I spend my days reading contracts designed to hide things and finding exactly what they're hiding. I'm good at my job. Quietly, methodically, unremarkably good, in the way that people who do essential work behind closed doors tend to be. No one claps for you. No one writes your name on a wall. You just keep the machinery from grinding itself apart, and when it runs smoothly, everyone assumes it was always going to. This is the story of how the family of the man I loved tried to buy me out of his life for £30,000. How they looked at my rented flat, my ordinary name, my lack of a horse in the country or a trust fund, or a mother who lunched at Fortnum's, and decided I was a problem that could be solved with a check and a non-disclosure clause. And this is the story of what happened when they found out they were wrong about every single thing they believed about me. Not because I shouted. Not because I caused a scene or hired a publicist or burned their reputation to the ground, though I will admit the thought crossed my mind more than once, usually around 2 a.m. when the flat was too quiet and the anger sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't cough up. No. What happened was much simpler than that, and much worse for them. Because the truth, when it finally arrived at that mahogany table, didn't come with fury. It came with paperwork. And if there is one thing I have learned in 9 years of government service, it is this. The most dangerous thing in any room is not the person who is angry. It is the person who is patient, who is precise, and who has read every single page. My name is Clara Whitfield. I was 31 years old when I sat at that table, and I need you to understand who I was before any of this happened, because the version of me they saw and the version of me that actually existed were two entirely different women. I grew up in Ipswich, in a narrow terrace house on Caldwell Avenue, where the radiators clanked all winter, and the back garden was just big enough for a washing line and my grandmother's rosemary bush. My mother left when I was 4. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it is the reason my grandmother raised me, and my grandmother is the reason I am who I am, and without understanding her, you will not understand a single thing that comes after. Her name was Dorothy Whitfield. Dot, everyone called her, though she hated it. She had been a civil servant her entire working life, 37 years at the Home Office, processing immigration cases back when the paperwork was done by hand, and every file smelled of carbon paper and instant coffee. She never rose above senior executive officer. She never complained about that, not once. What she told me instead, on my 14th birthday, while we were sitting in the kitchen eating Battenberg cake she had made herself because she refused to buy one from Tesco, was this. Clara, power is not what people give you. Power is what you know that they don't, and the discipline to stay quiet until it matters. I remember looking at her across the table and thinking she was just a tired old woman who was trying to make poverty sound noble. I was 14. I was stupid. It took me 17 more years to understand she had handed me the most precise weapon I would ever carry. I studied law at the University of East Anglia, not Oxford, not Cambridge, and people like the Ashfords noticed that distinction with the subtlety of a fire alarm. I did well, not brilliantly, solidly. I graduated with an upper second and applied directly to the government legal department, which most people have never heard of because it does not appear in films and nobody writes thrillers about it. We advise ministers, We draft legislation. We review contracts between government bodies and private entities worth hundreds of millions of pounds. It is painstaking, tedious, occasionally fascinating work, and I was very, very good at it. By the time I met Julian, I was a grade 7 legal advisor specializing in public procurement. I had been involved in reviewing defense contracts, infrastructure agreements, PFI deals for NHS hospital builds. I could read a 40-page commercial lease and find the clause that would collapse the entire arrangement in under an hour. My colleagues respected me. My line manager, a quiet Scotsman named Alistair Grieve, once told me during my annual review that I had the most irritating talent he had ever encountered, which was the ability to be right without making anyone feel attacked. He said it like a compliment. I took it as one. But here is the thing about people like me. We do not look like what we are. I am 5'4". I have brown hair that I usually pull back because it gets in my face when I am reading. I wear glasses. I own exactly 3 work blazers, all from John Lewis, all navy. I do not own a single piece of clothing that costs more than £90, and that includes the dress I wore to Julian's mother's 60th birthday, which she looked at the way you might look at a stain on a restaurant tablecloth. I do not drive an expensive car. I drive a 12-year-old Vauxhall Corsa with a scratch on the passenger door from a Sainsbury's car park in Norwich. I do not carry designer handbags. I carry a canvas tote from the British Library gift shop because it has a quote from Virginia Woolf on it, and it fits my laptop perfectly. I say all of this not because I am proud of being modest. I am not modest. I simply do not care about those things, and the inability of certain people to understand that a woman can be valuable without being expensive is not my problem. It is theirs. There is one more thing you need to know about me. My left knee. I tore the anterior cruciate ligament playing football when I was 23, a 5-a-side match in Eaton Park with colleagues from the Norwich office. The surgery went well, but the recovery was slow, and I spent 4 months limping around my flat in Thorpe Hamlet, reading case law and eating soup because I could not stand long enough to cook properly. I still feel it when it rains. I still feel it when I climb stairs quickly. And I felt it that night at the Ashfords' dining table, a dull throb beneath the cloth, reminding me that I had been hurt before and healed before, and that pain is not something that destroys you. It is something that teaches you where the edges of your body are. Julian's mother once saw me rub my knee at a garden party. She leaned toward her friend Patricia and murmured, loud enough for me to hear, that it was probably from kneeling on government office floors. Patricia laughed. I did not. I memorized it. I placed it alongside every other remark, every raised eyebrow, every tiny cruelty, like documents in a file, like evidence in a case that I was not yet ready to bring. My grandmother taught me that. Not the anger. Anyone can do anger. She taught me the filing. She taught me that memory, properly organized, is more devastating than any outburst. And she taught me one more thing. In the last year of her life, when the cancer had taken most of her weight, but none of her clarity. She was sitting in her armchair by the window in the hospice in Ipswich, watching the rain come across the rooftops, and she looked at me with those pale gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and she said, "Clara, when the time comes, and it will come, do not let them see you shake. Not because shaking is weakness, but because they will use it to convince themselves that you are the problem. And you are not the problem. You were never the problem." She died 11 days later. I did not cry at the funeral. I cried in my car, in the hospice car park, at 11:30 at night, with the engine off and the rain on the windscreen and the smell of her hand cream still on my coat collar. I cried until my ribs ached. Then I drove home, made a cup of tea, and went back to work the next morning. Because that is what Whitfield women do. We break in private, and in public, we are the most dangerous thing in the room. The quiet one. The one with the canvas bag and the scratched Corsa and the navy blazer from John Lewis. The one nobody watches. That is who sat at the Ashfords' dining table that evening. That is who they placed their contract in front of. And that is who they never, not for one single moment, thought to be afraid of. They never asked me a question. That is the thing I keep returning to, even now, years later. In all the months I sat across from them at Sunday lunches, in all the careful conversations about wedding venues and catering budgets and table linens, the Ashfords never once asked me a single genuine question about myself. Not what I did for a living, not really. James had told them I worked in planning, and his mother Eleanor had smiled thinly and said how nice, and that was the end of it. Planning. She heard the word and filed me under boring, under safe, under controllable. She never asked which department. She never asked what kind of planning. She never asked about the infrastructure contracts I managed for the Ministry of Defense, the ones that required security clearance and non-disclosure agreements, and the kind of meticulous, grinding competence that most people cannot sustain for 6 weeks, let alone 6 years. She never asked because she did not care. I was the girl her son had chosen, and her only project was to make sure I understood exactly how generous the Ashford family was being by allowing me in. The first time I met them was in March at their house in Esher, a wide Victorian semi on a tree-lined street, the gravel perfectly raked, the hedges professionally maintained. James drove us down from my flat in Guildford. He was nervous. I could tell because he kept adjusting the rear-view mirror, even though it did not need adjusting. He told me his mother could be a bit formal, but she meant well. He told me his father Richard was quiet but warm. He told me not to mention my student loans. I should have heard that. I should have heard the warning hidden inside the instruction. But I was 29, and I loved him, and I thought love was the thing that mattered. Eleanor opened the door, wearing a cream cashmere jumper and pearl earrings, and she looked at my shoes before she looked at my face. I noticed. I am trained to notice. My shoes were clean black flats from Clark's, perfectly reasonable, and the flicker of assessment lasted less than a second, but I caught it. She smiled and kissed my cheek, and the perfume was Joe Malone, and the house smelled of roasting lamb, and everything was beautiful and wrong. Dinner was 3 courses. Richard carved the lamb, Eleanor poured the wine, and for 90 minutes they talked about people I did not know, holidays I had not been on, and schools I had not attended. I sat and I listened and I smiled and I answered the few questions that drifted my way like afterthoughts. Where did I grow up? Basingstoke. And my parents? Mum worked in a school office, Dad was gone. Meaning dead? Eleanor asked, and I said, no, meaning gone, and there was a silence that tasted like judgment. James squeezed my hand under the table. I let him think that helped. The second visit was worse. It was June, a garden party for Eleanor's birthday. 30 guests on the lawn with Pims and cucumber sandwiches, and a string duo playing Debussy. James introduced me to his aunt, his uncle, 2 cousins, and a family friend called Margaret who ran a gallery in Richmond. Margaret asked what I did, and I said project management for government contracts, and she said, how industrious, the way you might say, how industrious about a terrier learning to fetch. I was standing by the hydrangeas when I heard Eleanor talking to Margaret near the kitchen window. The window was open. They did not know I was there, or perhaps they did not care. She is perfectly pleasant, Eleanor said, but she brings nothing. No family to speak of, no connections, no assets. James could have had anyone, and he chose a girl from Basingstoke who drives a Vauxhall Corsa. Margaret laughed softly. Perhaps she is good for him in other ways. Perhaps, Eleanor said, but good for him is not the same as good for this family. I stood by those hydrangeas for a very long time. The petals were blue, turning purple at the edges. I remember that because I stared at them until my breathing slowed and my jaw unclenched, and the heat behind my eyes cooled to something harder. Something patient. I did not tell James. That was my first mistake, or my first strategy. Even now I am not sure which. The third incident was at Christmas. We had been together 14 months. James gave me a ring on Christmas morning in his childhood bedroom with the wallpaper he had picked when he was 12, little sailing boats on a cream background. And I said yes because I meant it. I loved him. I loved the way he read on the sofa with one sock off. I loved the way he sang badly in the shower and pretended he had not. I loved the parts of him that were just James, separate from the house in Esher and the raked gravel and the carefully maintained expectations. We came downstairs and announced it, and Richard shook my hand and said, "Welcome to the family." And Eleanor smiled and said, "How wonderful." And then she turned to James and said, "Darling, we should discuss the practical arrangements." And by practical arrangements, she did not mean caterers or florists. She meant me. She meant what I was bringing. She meant what I was worth. That conversation happened in January, in their sitting room. James was there. Richard was there. Eleanor sat in the wing-back chair by the fireplace, and she had prepared an actual folder. Pale blue, printed labels. Inside were details of property values and pension projections, and what she called a framework for financial transparency. She wanted to know my savings, my debts, my salary. She wanted me to sign a prenuptial agreement that James's family solicitor had already drafted, a solicitor I had never met, producing a document I had never been consulted on, protecting assets I had never threatened. James sat beside me. He did not object. He did not say, "This is inappropriate," or "She has a right to privacy," or even "Let us talk about this later." He sat with his hands folded, and he looked at the carpet, and he let his mother hand me a 7-page legal document as though this were completely normal. Eleanor explained the terms. If the marriage ended within 5 years, I would receive nothing. If it ended after 5 years, I would receive a modest settlement calculated against my own earnings at the time, not against James's. The house, which Richard would help them purchase, would remain an Ashford asset. Any inheritance James received would be ring-fenced. Any business James started with family capital would be excluded from division. I would sign away claims to everything the Ashfords had built before I arrived, and everything they intended to build after. She presented this calmly. She smiled while she did it, and Richard, quiet Richard, warm Richard, sat in his leather armchair and said nothing at all. I looked at James. He met my eyes for about 2 seconds and then looked away. That is when I understood something that Nan had once told me in her kitchen in Andover, stirring soup with a wooden spoon. She had said, "Watch what people do when it costs them something to stand up for you. That is the only test that matters." James failed. I did not shout. I did not cry. I picked up the folder and I said, "I will read this carefully." And Eleanor looked surprised, as though she had expected either grateful compliance or emotional collapse, and received neither. I tucked the folder into my canvas bag, the one she had glanced at with that familiar micro-expression of distaste, and I thanked them for the tea, and we drove home in silence. The silence in the car lasted 17 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the way you watch a wound, waiting to see if it will stop bleeding on its own or if you need to apply pressure. James drove with both hands on the wheel, which he never did. He was a one-hand driver, the other always resting on my knee or fiddling with the radio or gesturing at something out the window. 2 hands meant he was holding on. We were on the A303, heading back toward Salisbury when he finally spoke. He said, "They mean well." and something inside me went very quiet. Not angry quiet, not sad quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when you have been standing in a room you thought was yours, and you realize the walls have been painted to look like walls, but they are actually doors, and they have been open the whole time, and you just never looked hard enough to see. I said nothing. He glanced at me and then back at the road and said, "It is just how their world works, Meg. It is not personal." And I thought about how strange that sentence was. A contract that tells a woman what happens to her body, her money, her future children, and her home if she fails to meet conditions written by people who have known her for 2 years and never once asked her a real question. Not personal. I opened the folder when we got home. James went upstairs. I heard the shower running and I sat at the kitchen table, the one we had bought together from a second-hand shop in Wilton, and I read every page. I read it slowly, the way Nan taught me to read anything that mattered. She used to say, "Do not skim the things that scare you. Fear lives in the parts you skip." The prenuptial agreement was 31 pages. It had been drafted by a firm in London whose letterhead alone probably cost more than my monthly mortgage contribution. The terms were organized into sections with Roman numerals and subheadings, and they were written in that particular kind of legal language that sounds reasonable until you understand what it actually means. Section 3 stated that in the event of divorce within the first 5 years, I would receive nothing. Not a share of any property, not a maintenance payment, nothing. Section 5 addressed children. If we had children and divorced, primary custody would default to James unless I could demonstrate in court that he was unfit, and the definition of unfit was narrow enough to drive a needle through. Section 7 covered what they called reputational obligations, which meant I was not to discuss the Ashworth family finances, business dealings, or personal matters with anyone outside the family, during the marriage or after, under penalty of financial sanctions. Section 9 required me to leave my job at the Ministry of Defense within 12 months of the wedding and relocate to Dorset. Leave my job. Leave the career I had built over 9 years, the clearance I held, the work I did that I could not even fully describe to my own fiancé because of classification protocols. Leave it and move to a house in the countryside that Eleanor would help us choose, which meant Eleanor would choose it, and become available for the life she had already designed for me without asking whether I wanted to live it. I sat with that folder open in front of me for a long time. The shower upstairs stopped. I heard James moving around the bedroom. I heard him open a beer. I heard him turn on the television, something with crowd noise, football probably. He did not come downstairs. And that was the moment. Not the contract itself. The contract was just paper. It was the sound of the television. It was James choosing comfort over confrontation, choosing the path where he did not have to look at my face and reckon with what his parents had put in front of me. He had been sitting in that room when Eleanor laid the folder on the table. He had read it before, or at least known its contents. He had said nothing then, and he was saying nothing now. Nan died 4 years before this night. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late because she was the kind of woman who did not complain about pain until it was no longer pain but something else entirely. I was with her at the Royal Hampshire in Winchester during the last week. She could barely speak by then, but on the Tuesday before she went, she took my hand and said something that I carried out of that hospital and into every room I have entered since. She said, "You will know when it is time to stop being patient, because patience will stop feeling like strength and start feeling like permission." Sitting at that kitchen table in Salisbury, with the Ashworth prenuptial agreement open to Section 9 and James watching football upstairs, I felt it. The shift. It was not dramatic. There was no surge of fury, no moment of cinematic clarity where the music swells and the heroine stands up and the light catches her face. It was more like a door closing, softly, completely, and with the certain knowledge that I would not open it again. I closed the folder. I stacked it neatly. I put it back in my canvas bag. Then I took out a notebook, the small green one I kept in my bag for work, and I began to write. Not a letter, not a speech, a list. The kind of list you make when you are done reacting and ready to act. Phone numbers, dates, names, steps. I did not go upstairs that night. I slept on the sofa with a blanket pulled up to my chin and the kitchen light still on. And when James came down in the morning and saw me there, he looked confused, as though the idea that his silence might have consequences had genuinely never occurred to him. He said, "Did you fall asleep down here?" Not a question, really, a hope that the answer would be simple. I said, "Yes," and I got up and made coffee and went to work and did not mention the contract. Not that day. Not the next. Not for 3 months. I let him believe that my silence was acceptance. I let Eleanor believe it too, when she called the following week and asked, so pleasantly, whether I had had a chance to review the documents and whether I had any little questions. No, I said. No little questions. I had large ones. But I was not going to ask them. I was going to answer them myself. The first thing I did was find a lawyer who had nothing to do with the Alderton name. That sounds simple. It was not. James's father had been a partner at Harding Kessler for 22 years before he retired, and his reach into the legal community in Hartford was the kind of quiet infrastructure you do not see until you try to move around it. The first attorney I called, a woman named Dana Prescott on Farmington Avenue, asked me within 3 minutes who my fiancé was. When I told her, there was a pause. She said she would be happy to refer me to a colleague. The colleague turned out to be a man who had golfed with Richard Alderton at the Hartford Golf Club for a decade. I did not call him. I drove to New Haven instead. 45 minutes on I-91 on a Tuesday morning, while James thought I was at a dentist appointment. I found a family law office on Chapel Street, 2 blocks from the Yale campus, run by a woman named Genevieve Torres, who had never heard the name Alderton and did not care. She was in her late 50s, small, with reading glasses on a chain, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like the only case on her desk. I sat across from her and placed the contract on the table and watched her read it. She read slowly. She turned pages without expression. When she finished, she took off her glasses and set them down and said, "This is not a prenuptial agreement." I said, "I know." She said, "This is a financial quarantine. Whoever drafted this wanted to make sure that if the marriage ended for any reason, you would leave with exactly what you arrived with, adjusted for inflation, minus any shared expenses they could document." She said, "There is a clause here, Section 9, subsection C, that effectively gives his parents veto power over any major purchase made with combined funds during the marriage." She said, "I have seen aggressive prenups. This is not aggressive. This is architectural. Someone spent a lot of time on this." I asked her what my options were. She told me. I listened. I took notes in a small notebook I had bought at a drugstore in Hamden on the way, because I did not want to use my phone where anything could sync to a shared cloud. That sounds paranoid. 3 months earlier, it would have sounded paranoid to me too, but I had watched Eleanor Alderton slide a folder across a table with the confidence of someone who had done this before, or at least rehearsed it, and paranoia no longer felt like an overreaction. It felt like paying attention. Genevieve told me several things that morning. She told me that the contract as written would likely be enforceable in Connecticut, though certain provisions could be challenged. She told me that the veto clause was unusual and potentially vulnerable, but that challenging it would require resources and time and a willingness to make the Alderton family very uncomfortable. She told me that the smartest thing I could do was not to fight the contract. It was to understand my own position so thoroughly that the contract became irrelevant. She asked me about my finances. I told her. She did not react, which I appreciated. My salary at the time was $61,000. I had $43,000 in savings, most of it from the years I had lived frugally in a studio apartment in East Hartford before moving in with James. I had no debt. I had a retirement account through the state that was small but growing. I had a car that was paid off, a 9-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking garage in New Britain. I had, in other words, exactly the kind of modest and disciplined financial life that the Aldertons looked at and saw as evidence of inadequacy rather than competence. Genevieve told me to document everything. She said it quietly, the way someone tells you to put on a seatbelt. Not because there is going to be a crash, but because there might be, and you will not have time to reach for it later. She told me to keep records of every contribution I made to the household. Groceries, utilities, repairs. She told me to photograph receipts. She told me to open a separate account at a bank I did not share with James, and to begin, slowly, moving a portion of my savings there. Not hiding it, protecting it. I did all of this. Over the following weeks, then months, I built a quiet architecture of my own. I opened an account at a credit union in Middletown, a town where I had no connection and no reason to go, except that it was far enough away. I started a spreadsheet. I logged dates and amounts. I kept every receipt in a manila envelope in the bottom of a box of old textbooks in the back of the closet. The kind of box no one opens because it looks like it holds nothing of value. James noticed nothing. That was the part that hurt, although I had expected it. He did not notice that I was leaving the house earlier on certain mornings. He did not notice that I had stopped contributing to the joint savings account we had talked about using for the wedding. He did not notice that when his mother called, I answered with exactly the right amount of warmth, the precise temperature that Eleanor would interpret as compliance. I had studied her. I had watched her the way you watch weather when you live near the coast, not because you love it, but because you need to know what is coming. Once, in February, James found the manila envelope. He had been looking for a phone charger in the closet and knocked the box sideways. Receipts spilled across the carpet. He picked one up, a grocery receipt from Stop and Shop, and looked at it, and looked at me and said, "Why are you keeping grocery receipts?" I said, "For taxes." He said, "We do not itemize groceries." I said, "I might start." He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. I could see him deciding whether this was strange enough to pursue. It was not. He put the receipt back in the envelope and the envelope back in the box and went to find his charger, and that was the end of it. He was so accustomed to my efficiency being invisible that he could not see it even when it was lying on the floor in front of him. That was not cruelty. That was habit. And habit, I was learning, was the most dangerous thing in a relationship. Not because it destroys love, but because it replaces love so gradually that no one notices the substitution until they reach for love one day and find only routine in its place. The engagement dinner was held at the Fairmont in Georgetown. Marcus's mother had reserved a private dining room on the second floor, the one with the walnut paneling and the view of the canal. 26 guests, linen napkins folded into bishop's hats, 3 kinds of wine already breathing on a side table when I arrived. I know these details because I had helped select the linens 4 months earlier. I know because I had suggested the Fairmont after Patricia mentioned the Willard but worried about parking. I know because I had called the events coordinator twice to confirm the seating chart that Patricia later told guests she had arranged herself. None of this bothered me anymore. I was past the point of being bothered. I was in the calm place, the one my grandmother had described once without naming it. She had said, "There is a moment when water stops fighting the rock and simply finds another way around." I was the water now. Marcus looked beautiful that night. I will give him that. Navy suit, no tie, the watch his father had given him for law school graduation. He kissed me on the cheek when I walked in and said, "You look incredible." And I believed he meant it. That was the thing about Marcus. He was never pretending. He was simply never paying full attention. There is a difference, and it matters, and it also does not matter at all when the result is the same. The first hour moved the way these evenings do. Cocktails, his Georgetown friends asking about the wedding date, my friend Yolanda, the one person I had been allowed to invite from outside the approved list, standing near the window with a glass of sparkling water because she was 4 months pregnant and not telling anyone yet. She caught my eye twice. She knew something was coming. She did not know what. I had not told her the details. I had only told her to stay until dessert. At 8:15, Gerald Whitfield stood. He tapped his glass with a butter knife, which I thought was a strange choice for a man who had argued before the Supreme Court, but formality has its own logic. The room quieted. Patricia straightened in her chair, and I saw her hand move to the folder beneath her clutch purse, and my pulse did not change. I had spent 4 months watching my own pulse. I had trained it. Gerald said he wanted to welcome everyone. He said he was proud of Marcus. He said the Whitfield family had a tradition of careful stewardship, of protecting what generations had built, and that this was not something to apologize for, but something to honor. He said love was important. He paused after that word, in a way that made it clear he considered it necessary, but insufficient. Then he said that Marcus and I had agreed to formalize certain understandings before the wedding, and that he hoped I would not mind if they took a moment to acknowledge that publicly, since transparency was itself a form of respect. He opened the folder. He slid a document across the table toward me. 3 pages, cream paper, the letterhead of a K Street firm I recognized because I had once delivered documents there during my 2nd year at Howard. Marcus looked at the table. Not at me, at the table. I picked up the document. I did not need to read it because I already had a copy. I had obtained a copy 7 weeks earlier through my attorney, Denise Okafor, who had submitted a formal discovery request after I had quietly filed a prenuptial counteroffer that the Whitfields did not yet know existed. But I read it anyway, slowly, because I wanted the room to watch me read it. I wanted them to see a woman who was not surprised. The terms were clear. In the event of divorce within the first 10 years, I would receive nothing from the Whitfield family trust. I would forfeit any claim to property acquired during the marriage if the source of funds could be traced to family accounts. I would agree to a non-disclosure clause covering family financial matters. And I would agree that any children would maintain primary residence at the Whitfield family home in McLean, Virginia, with visitation to be determined at the discretion of a mediator selected by the family. I set the document down. I looked at Marcus. He was still looking at the table. I said, "Did you read this?" He said, "My father's attorneys drafted it." I said, "That is not what I asked." The room had gone silent in the way rooms go silent when people realize they are witnessing something they were not meant to witness, even though they had been invited specifically to witness it. Gerald was watching me. Patricia was watching Gerald. Yolanda was watching everyone. I opened my own purse. I took out a manila envelope, the same one I had been building for 4 months, the one that had started with grocery receipts and ended with a forensic accounting summary prepared by a CPA named Ruth Abrams, who had spent 20 years auditing nonprofits and knew exactly how to trace money through family foundations. I said, "I have a counteroffer." Gerald said, "This is not a negotiation, Claire." I said, "You are right, it is not. Because a negotiation requires 2 parties acting in good faith, and this document was drafted without my consultation, presented in public to pressure my agreement, and contains a custody provision that no family court in Virginia would enforce. So this is not a negotiation, Gerald. This is a correction." I handed the envelope to Marcus. Not to Gerald, to Marcus. Because this was always about Marcus. About whether he would look at me. About whether he was capable of seeing what was in front of him when it was no longer invisible. Marcus opened the envelope. He pulled out the first page. It was the forensic summary. 6 pages of line items showing every dollar I had contributed to the household over 3 years. The mortgage payments routed through his account but funded by my transfers. The renovation deposits. The insurance premiums. The tuition for his younger sister's summer program, which Patricia had asked me to cover temporarily and never repaid. The total at the bottom of the 6th page was $91,412. Marcus looked at the number. Then he looked at me. For the first time that evening, he was seeing me. The second document was my counter-prenuptial agreement, filed with the Arlington County Circuit Court and co-signed by Denise Okafor. It did not ask for anything from the Whitfield Trust. It asked for equitable division of jointly acquired assets. It asked for standard custody provisions under Virginia Family Code. It asked for the removal of the non-disclosure clause, which Denise had flagged as potentially unenforceable and certainly unconscionable. It was 6 pages long. It was clean. It was fair. And it had already been reviewed by a judge who had written in the margin, in pencil, a note that said, "Sensible." Gerald reached for the document. I put my hand on it. I said, "This copy is for Marcus." Gerald said, "I represent this family's interests." I said, "And Denise Okafor represents mine. You may contact her office Monday morning. The address is on the letterhead." Patricia's face had not moved since I opened the envelope. She was frozen in the expression she wore when she was calculating, the one I had seen over 3 Christmases and 2 summers and 1 very long Thanksgiving in Hilton Head, when she had rearranged the seating chart to place me between 2 cousins who did not speak to each other. She was recalculating. I could almost hear it. Marcus put the papers down. He said, "Claire, I did not know about the custody clause." I said, "I know." He said, "I would not have agreed to that." I said, "I know that too. That is why I am still here. That is why I did not leave 4 months ago when I first saw the draft, because I wanted to give you the chance to look at this and choose. Not what your father wants, not what your mother arranged, what you see when you actually look." The room stayed silent. 26 people breathing quietly. Yolanda set her water glass down without a sound. Outside, through the window, a barge moved slowly up the canal, its lights reflecting on the dark water. Marcus picked up my counter-prenuptial. He read the first page, then the second. His father started to speak, and Marcus held up one hand, palm flat, without looking up. And Gerald Whitfield, who had argued before the highest court in the country, stopped talking. Marcus read every page, all 14. The room was so quiet I could hear the canal water lapping against the stone embankment outside. That soft, rhythmic sound Amsterdam makes when the wind is low and the city is holding its breath. When he finished, he set the document down and placed both hands flat on the table. His knuckles were white, not from anger, from something worse. from the slow recognition that the woman sitting across from him had understood a version of his family that he had spent 31 years refusing to see. He looked at his father first, then his mother, then back at the document. He said, "You wrote this before we were engaged." Gerald said nothing. Marcus said it again. "You wrote this before I proposed, before I even told you I was going to propose. Which means you already had a lawyer draft terms for a woman you assumed had nothing, before I even asked her." Yolanda reached for her wine. Gerald cleared his throat and began to say something about prudent planning, about protecting generational wealth, about how any responsible family would take steps to ensure financial clarity before a marriage. And Marcus said, "Stop. Just stop." He did not raise his voice. He said it the way you close a door you are never going to open again. I watched him, and I felt something I did not expect. Not triumph, not vindication. Grief. Because I loved this man, and I was watching him understand, in real time, in front of his family and mine, that his parents had moved around him like he was furniture. They had planned. They had drafted. They had anticipated a version of his life that did not include his own decisions, only theirs executed through him. Marcus turned to me. His eyes were red but dry. He said, "You knew about this for 4 months. You sat across from me every morning. You cooked with me. You slept next to me. And you carried this." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Because I needed to know what you would do when you saw it yourself, not when I told you what to feel. When you saw the paper and chose." He nodded. Once. Then he stood up and walked out of the dining room. Not dramatically, not slamming anything. He just stood, pushed his chair in neatly, and walked down the hallway to the bedroom. The door closed with a soft click. 26 people sat in silence and listened to that click echo off the old ceiling beams. What happened after that night unfolded over 11 weeks. I will tell you the concrete details because the concrete details are what mattered. Marcus did not speak to his parents for 19 days. Not a call, not a text, not a reply to Yolanda's voicemails, which started furious and became pleading by day 6. Gerald sent one email, 3 paragraphs long, explaining his legal reasoning. Marcus forwarded it to me without comment. I read it once and deleted it. It was exactly what you would expect. Clinical, reasonable, completely missing the point. On day 20, Marcus called his mother and spoke to her for 40 minutes. I was not in the room, and he did not tell me everything they discussed. But when he came out, his face looked older, like someone who had traveled a long distance and arrived somewhere he did not want to be. He told me his mother had said she was trying to protect him. He told me his father had said the same thing, but used different words. He told me he believed they believed it, and that believing it did not make it true. Marcus and I did not break up. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you expected us to. We did not. But something changed between us that was permanent, not damaged, rearranged. He started asking me questions he had never asked before. About my work, about the advisory firm, the specific cases, the strategies. He came to my office one Thursday and sat in the corner while I ran a consultation with a tech client restructuring their European operations. And afterward he said, "I had no idea you did this. I had no idea this was what your days looked like." And I heard in his voice the echo of every dinner where he had talked about his projects, and I had listened, and he had never once asked about mine. And he was only now realizing the silence had not been emptiness. It had been patience. The financial outcomes were specific. Gerald's original prenuptial would have limited my claim in any divorce to a flat settlement of €40,000, regardless of marriage length, contribution, or circumstance. My counter-document, which Lisbeth had helped me draft with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years dissecting exactly these kinds of agreements, proposed a standard Dutch community of property framework with equitable provisions for both parties. Nothing radical, nothing punitive, just fair. Marcus signed it on a Wednesday afternoon in Lisbeth's office on Keizersgracht. He read it one more time, looked at me, and signed. Gerald was not present. Gerald was not invited. Yolanda called me directly once. Only once. It was a Tuesday, early, before 8. She said she wanted me to understand that she had always liked me personally, and that the prenuptial was not about me as a person, it was about the family's position. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Yolanda, it was always about me as a person. That is what a prenuptial is. It is a document that says, this is what we think you are worth. And you decided I was worth €40,000 and a signature on a line." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I suppose I did not think of it that way." And I said, "I know you did not. That is the problem." Marcus's sister Annalise sent me a text 3 days after the dinner. It said only, "I should have said something years ago. I am sorry I did not." I replied, "You are saying it now." She and I met for coffee in the Jordan the following week. She told me things about growing up in that family that I had suspected but never confirmed. The way Gerald decided things and Yolanda arranged the details, and the children were expected to perform their roles without deviation. She said Marcus had always been the one who tried hardest to please them both, and that watching him walk out of that dining room was the first time she had ever seen him choose himself. My grandmother called me the morning after the dinner. She had been seated at the far end of the table, next to my cousin Bram, and she had watched everything without speaking. On the phone, she said, "Your grandfather would have been proud of you. Not because you won, because you waited." I held the phone and pressed it hard against my ear and closed my eyes. She said, "He always said the ones who shout first have already lost the argument. You did not shout at all." I said, "I wanted to. Many times." She said, "Of course you did. That is what makes not shouting mean something." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I made tea and forgot to drink it, and made another cup and forgot that one too. The apartment was quiet in a way it had not been for months. Not the tense quiet of waiting for a phone call or dreading a knock at the door. Just quiet. The kind where you can hear the radiator tick and the wind press against the window, and your own breathing settle into something slower than it has been in a very long time. My grandfather died when I was 19. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the way that particular disease always is. He was a civil engineer who spent 40 years building bridges in the eastern provinces. Literal bridges. Concrete and steel over rivers and gorges and places most people in Rotterdam never think about. He retired with a modest pension and a drawer full of commendation letters he never framed. My grandmother once told me she found them in a shoebox under his winter sweaters when she was looking for mothballs. He had not mentioned a single one. He used to say something to me when I was small and upset about the usual childhood injustices. Someone cutting in line, a teacher who gave the prize to the wrong student. He would sit me on his knee and say, "Lena, the truth is patient. It does not need you to carry it. It carries itself. You just need to still be standing when it arrives." I thought about that phrase constantly during the months I spent preparing. When I was sitting in Willem Hendricks's office, going through financial disclosures and trust structures and corporate filings. When I was lying awake at 3 a.m, wondering if I was being petty, if I was being vindictive, if maybe I should just let the contract go and walk away from Marcus and his family and start clean. The phrase came back like a heartbeat. The truth is patient. You just need to still be standing. But here is what I did not expect. I expected that after the dinner, after the truth arrived exactly the way I had prepared for it to arrive, I would feel vindicated. I expected some version of triumph, however quiet. What I actually felt was tired, deeply, thoroughly, bone-level tired. The kind of tired that is not about sleep, but about years of holding something in your chest that was never yours to hold. Because here is the thing I have to be honest about. I held on too long. I know that now. Not to Marcus. Marcus was kind to me, genuinely kind, and what we had in those early years in that apartment above the bicycle shop on Witte de Wittstraat was real. But I held on to the idea that his parents would change, that if I was patient enough, competent enough, gracious enough, they would eventually see me. And that was my mistake. Not because patience is wrong, but because I was patient with people who had never once asked themselves whether they might be the ones who needed to change. Adrian Voss was not a villain. I have thought about this a great deal, and I want to be precise. He was a man who had built something substantial from almost nothing, and who believed that his success entitled him to arrange the world around his children the way he arranged supply chains and quarterly reports. Margot was not cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. She was a woman who had married into expectation and performed it so long that performance became identity. They were not evil, they were certain. And certainty, when it goes unexamined for decades, becomes its own kind of violence. I do not forgive them. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is a word people use when they want the person who was hurt to make the situation comfortable again. And I am done making situations comfortable for people who never once extended that courtesy to me. But I understand them. I understand how Adrian could sit across a table from his future daughter-in-law and slide a contract toward her without feeling any shame. In his mind, he was protecting his son. In his mind, the contract was rational. He never considered that rationality without empathy is just cruelty with a spreadsheet. My grandmother understood this distinction. She was not telling me to forgive when she said my grandfather would have been proud. She was telling me something subtler, that there is a difference between winning and surviving, and that sometimes the bravest thing is not the strike, but the stillness that precedes it. My grandfather built bridges his whole life. He understood load-bearing. He understood that the structure that endures is not the one that fights the river, but the one that lets the river pass beneath it. I think I held too much weight for too long. I think I should have spoken sooner. Not at the dinner, not with documents and lawyers, but years earlier. The first time Margot looked through me at a family gathering. The first time Adrian made a comment about where I came from. I should have turned to Marcus and said, "This is not acceptable, and if you cannot see that, then we need to talk about what this relationship actually is." I did not say that. I absorbed it. I filed it away. I told myself that love meant endurance, and that endurance meant silence, and that silence meant strength. But silence is only strength when it is chosen. When it is forced on you by the fear that speaking will cost you everything, it is not strength. It is survival. And there is a difference. I know that now. I did not know it then. The truth is patient, my grandfather said. He was right. But I wish someone had also told me that I was allowed to be impatient. That demanding respect is not the same as demanding love. That you can love someone and still refuse to sit at a table where you are treated as less than you are. I poured the cold tea down the sink and watched it spiral away. Outside, the canal reflected the last gray light of a November afternoon. A cyclist passed with no lights on, just a dark shape moving through the dusk. I thought about my grandfather, standing on some half-finished bridge in Limburg, looking down at a river he was learning to span. I thought about the shoebox full of commendation letters he never showed anyone. I thought about the quiet way he carried what he had built, never needing anyone to see it for it to be real. I thought about the way he would sit at the kitchen table after dinner, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and just look out at the garden he had planted himself. He never called it meditation. He never called it anything. He just sat there, and when I asked him what he was thinking about, he would say something like, "The tomatoes need more sun," or, "Your grandmother would have liked how the roses came in this year." Simple things. Things that mattered to no one but him. And I think that was the point. He did not need the world to witness his contentment for it to count. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and walked to the living room. The flat was quiet. Not the heavy quiet of loneliness, but the kind of quiet you earn. The canal outside had gone fully dark now, and the streetlights along the Prinsengracht were starting to flicker on, their reflections wobbling on the water like something uncertain trying to hold its shape. I sat down on the sofa and pulled the wool blanket over my knees. It was one I had bought myself, from a small shop in the Jordan, the week after I moved in. I remember the shopkeeper asking me if it was a gift for someone, and I said yes. She asked who, and I said me. She laughed and wrapped it in tissue paper anyway. That was 8 months ago. 8 months since the courtroom. 6 months since the last time Stefan called. 4 months since his mother sent a letter through her lawyer requesting that I return a set of silver candlesticks that had apparently belonged to the Vanderburg family for 3 generations. I did not have them. I had never had them. My lawyer responded with a single paragraph, and that was the end of it. I do not know what their lives look like now. I do not spend time imagining it. There was a period, maybe the first 2 months, when I would catch myself constructing scenarios. Stefan sitting in his parents' dining room, the contract still on the table, his father explaining why the situation was actually my fault. His mother adjusting the flowers and saying nothing, him nodding. I would build these little scenes in my head like dioramas, placing each figure exactly where I expected them to be, and then I would stop and ask myself what purpose this served. The answer was always none. So I stopped. I work. I wake up early and I take the tram to the office and I sit at my desk and I do the thing I trained for years to do. I assess risk. I read contracts. I find the clause that everyone else skipped over because it seemed unimportant. It turns out that is a valuable skill, noticing what other people overlook. Joris promoted me in September. He did not make a speech. He just handed me the new contract and said, "You earned this a long time ago, Lika. I am sorry it took us this long." I signed it and went back to my desk and finished reviewing a procurement file for a naval logistics project. That evening, I bought myself a bottle of wine from the shop on the corner and drank 1 glass standing at the kitchen window, watching the boats. That is what triumph looks like, I think. Not a crowd, not a gasp. Just a woman standing at her own window, in her own flat, drinking wine she bought with money she earned, looking at a city that does not care about her story. And that is fine. The city does not need to care. I care. That is enough. My grandfather's phrase comes back to me at odd hours, usually when I am tired, usually when something small has gone wrong, a miscalculation, a difficult colleague, a morning when the rain is so heavy that even the tram feels like a punishment. Build it so it stands when you are not watching. I used to think he was talking about bridges, about engineering, about the physical act of making something that holds weight. And he was. But he was also talking about the thing you build inside yourself when no one is paying attention. The structure of knowing who you are. The quiet architecture of not needing to prove it. I still have his letters in the shoebox. I moved them to the top shelf of my bedroom closet, next to a photograph of him standing on a construction site somewhere near Maastricht. He is wearing a hard hat and squinting into the sun, and behind him you can see the steel bones of something enormous rising out of the ground. He looks tired. He looks certain. He looks like a man who knows exactly what he is doing and does not need you to agree. If you are listening to this and you recognize something, not the details, those are mine, but the feeling. The feeling of sitting across from someone who is supposed to love you and realizing that what they love is the version of you that asks for nothing. If you recognize that, then I want to tell you something simple. You are allowed to leave that table. You are allowed to stand up, push your chair back, and walk out into whatever weather is waiting for you. It will not be warm. It will not be easy, but it will be yours. And that, in the end, is the only thing that has to be.